Let me introduce our speaker today, Dr. Charles Macal. Charles is a senior systems engineer and director of the Complex Adaptive Systems Group at Argonne National Lab. He applies computational modeling on a range of complex systems, including national security, energy, and defense. He has been a principal investigator for the development of Repass Symphony, which many of you are familiar with. It's one of the most widely used toolkits for agent-based modeling. Charles serves on the editorial boards of ACM Transactions on Modeling and Simulation, and also the journal called Simulation. He has co-authored the book in 2007 titled Managing Business Complexity. He is also an adjunct professor at the University of Chicago, and you can see he is with the Energy Policy Institute there and also the Computation Institute. Charles received his PhD in Industrial Engineering and Management Sciences from Northwestern, and he has his master's and bachelor's degree from Purdue University. He's an extraordinary scientist, a great person, amazing researcher, and we look forward to what he has to talk to us about on modeling complex systems, applications to energy. Please join me in welcoming Charles.
Thank you very much, Varun. I think I'll adjust this. Okay, it'll catch me. Okay. Well, I'm very happy to be here, and my thanks to Varun for inviting me to the symposium. This is my first trip to the University of Texas campus, so I've really enjoyed a kind of a delightful day walking around campus and stopping in the coffee shops and just seeing daily activities here. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is a subject dear to my heart, and it's a subject I talk about a lot, and basically that is complex systems, and in particular I'm going to talk about agent-based modeling. Okay, so I understand there's people from many disciplines and backgrounds in the audience, so I thought I'd give a quick introduction to complex systems and agent-based modeling. It may touch upon an area that you're working in or of interest. And then I'm going to transition over to energy systems as complex systems. And depending on how much time we have, I'll talk about applications, particularly in the area of energy, that I have been involved in and we have been involved in at the laboratory. And then I'll make some conclusions about what I think the future of not only complex systems and agent-based modeling might be, but also the future of analysis, as it's applied to these kind of problems. Okay, in a nutshell, complex systems are systems that are composed of many entities. The idea is that a system is built from the bottom up. So, in terms of what that means for analysis is a field called agent-based modeling. And that's really what I'm going to focus on, is coming out of complex systems. In terms of agent-based modeling, here's the basic idea. Agent-based modeling, I might generally refer to it as ABM, is a relatively new approach to modeling systems which are comprised of autonomous and interacting agents. Now, the notion of an agent and the kind of interactions they might have is a very general one. And that's why this idea is applicable to many fields. There are a growing number of agent-based modeling applications in a whole variety of fields. Everything from predicting the spread of epidemics to modeling consumer behavior and marketing and technology adoption. Also modeling crowd dynamics, pedestrian movements, etc. Hardly a simulation publication exists today without having an article of some form on agent-based modeling. There's a continuing interest in agent-based modeling on the part of sponsors who have funded programs. These include not only the Department of Energy, but the Department of Defense, Department of Transportation, National Institutes of Health, NSF, industry, and many, many others. So just a couple more slides on an overview, but this is the basic idea of agent-based modeling. You have three things. You have agents, you have interactions of those agents, and essentially you put it all together in an agent model. The notion of having agents and using models in this way is that of decentralization. Agents have their own behaviors and their own actions. Those actions affect other agents as well. Agents are what we call autonomous. They know what to do in their given situations they find themselves in their modeled world. There is no notion of central authority or, let's say, a global optimization approach. Instead, the system simply responds and moves forward by the processes that occur through the agent interactions. Generally, these processes go over time. So typically, the technique that is used is simulation as a modeling technique. In terms of the interactions are based on local information, which really means that all the agents are not interacting with all the other agents all of the time, only a limited subset. And as I mentioned earlier, agents live in a dynamic environment, potentially. There are many applications in a variety of areas of agent-based modeling. I've just taken a few off the internet. These are from the peer-reviewed literature, and they cover everything from air traffic control to anthropology and modeling the fall of ancient civilizations to ecological applications, many in energy analysis. I've only mentioned two here. Epidemic modeling, as I said, a great deal of interest in applying agent-based modeling to analyzing markets. And these could be markets that exist or don't even have to exist. For example, the people that are building one of the suborbital spacecraft have actually developed an agent-based model to understand what the market could be for space tourism. And many other applications, organizational decision-making. So next I'm going to talk about energy as a complex system. Imagine modeling the energy systems from the bottom up using an agent-based modeling approach. And the notion would be one would represent the supply sectors, not as a black box, as shown here, but as a detailed representation of all the entities that are making decisions in the energy sectors, as well as the physical infrastructure that consists of the energy system. And some of the applications I'll talk about, but on the top side, we have, imagine the demand sectors and consumers here on the very top making independent decisions about their choices of everything from energy technologies to fuels to investment behavior, potentially pricing, and other kinds of decisions that are made. And in between here, we have essentially energy markets. And this is the place where prices and quantities of energy come together. And through effectively what amounts to a series of agent interactions in the marketplace, energy is supply and demand is equated. So the basic approach to developing a view of the energy systems as a complex system is to first model the systems in layers. Here we have 4 layers: a regulatory layer, an economic business layer in which the business decisions are made, a physical layer which represents the physical infrastructure and the components that exist there. And then there could be other layers such as an environmental layer. The 2 layers I'm really going to focus on are the physical layer and then the economic and business layer. In effect, this is how one thinks of creating a model of the energy system using an agent-based approach. In the physical layer, the energy infrastructure is represented. Energy supply and production activities are represented. And energy utilization activities with respect to the technologies, devices, vehicles, transport, et cetera, are also represented explicitly. for the most part, there isn't very much decision-making going on within the physical layer, as this is, for the most part, the physical infrastructure. The exception to that statement, however, has to do with what we are coming to call smart devices, whether it be smart grid or smart appliances, smart toasters that we may have in our kitchens in a few years, etc. And in effect, these devices, these smart technologies, have their own behaviors. In effect, they make their own decisions. Now, someone may have programmed those decisions, of course, but nonetheless, this is where decision-making comes into the physical infrastructure. We haven't modeled that very much so far, but of course, in the future, we will have to do that a lot more than we've done before. In terms of the economic and business layer, this is where the interesting decisions are made, where the agents that I'll describe spend their time. So agents in this layer could be companies, they could be other kinds of organizations, they could be individual people, individual consumers, etc. But the considerations that go into decision-making include everything from the usual economic types of information, such as capital and operating costs, as well as financing requirements and availabilities, to basically consumer behaviors and standard business behaviors. In addition, possibly, to simple cost minimization or profit maximization. In addition, agents come together in this layer through the markets, whether they be energy markets, commodity markets, etc. So the markets represent another form of agent interaction. So in a nutshell, why would we take an agent approach to modeling the energy systems compared to how we've modeled them previously? Well, the simple answer is that the rules of business and social interaction are at least as important as the rules of physics when it comes to the generation, sale, pricing, and delivery of energy. So as I transition out of this introductory energy systems section, I wanted to give a few more examples. When we look at the agent-based modeling approach of the energy system from the ground up, we have agents, of course, and those agents have behaviors. They make the decisions. So oftentimes, when we would like to build a model of an energy system or an energy problem, the question is, who are the agents? The answer is, what entities are making decisions? Agents are heterogeneous over a population. So rather than assuming there's a typical agent or an average agent who is making decisions on consuming various things, we represent the full set of behaviors and decision criteria, potentially, that agents have over the entire population. This requires data, of course. Agents also learn and adapt. And we'd like to model that because that's what agents do, that's what people do in the real world. They learn and adapt, learn from experience, and they can adapt to changing conditions. Okay, some examples. Consumers making decisions about solar photovoltaic adoption. I'll talk about that in a few moments. As an example, consumers deciding on plug-in electric vehicle adoption. It's not enough to look at the economics of some of these technologies. There are other factors that are very important in understanding how adoption occurs. In terms of agent interactions, agents receive information and they compete for resources. Some examples: social networks through which agents receive information from trusted sources. So for example, in the solar photovoltaic community, there's a general understanding that people influence each other in terms of solar adoption. And in particular, if consumers have good experiences, those experiences become known and influence others in also adopting and making decisions. Another example of agent interactions are power markets and bilateral trading arrangements, where many agents come together, perhaps in an auction type system. And in the end, the result is an agreement upon how much power to produce and at what prices. Finally, there is an environment in which agents live, and generally this is the physical infrastructure, which constrains agents in space and time. An example would be the power grid, or a transport network, or in general, energy resource and distribution networks. So much for kind of the background. What I'm going to talk about now is an actual example that we've completed a few years ago. And this was an application of agent-based modeling to modeling the electric power market and its restructuring, in particular in the state of Illinois. The key, every analysis should start with the question. And here was the question we started with. When the Illinois electric power market is deregulated, what will happen? And what will happen to electricity prices, first and foremost? What will happen to the reliability of service? In addition, people wanted to know whether this would create market power on the part of certain producers or generating companies because of the nature of the power grid. These were the key questions in Illinois. A little background on electric power restructuring and deregulation. In the old days, which was, less than 10 years ago now, in fact, it's about 5 years ago now, we had a centralized electric power system where there was a single electricity price for the whole state. The rate of return was regulated by the Illinois Commerce Commission. In decentralization, companies are free to price their production and bid into what are called power pools. There is an independent system operator that matches supply and demand on a daily basis and clears the market one day ahead. That's what we call the day ahead market. People make their own decisions on what they consume, of course, as they always have. But there's new ways to calculate electricity prices. Instead of having one price for the whole state, now the price is more closely tied to what it costs to provide power to each point in the power grid network. And that's called locational marginal pricing. In Illinois, there were somewhere between 20 and 30 separate pricing zones that were on the grid. I say that because various slides of mine have different numbers on them, which I really have to clear up one of these days. But the Illinois Commerce Commission came to the laboratory, Argonne, and said, this is a big market restructuring we don't fully understand. And our former techniques, such as linear programming or system optimization, which worked well under the old monolithic structure, simply aren't applicable anymore. So the request was to use agent-based modeling and model all the individual agents and actors that comprise the new system and model their incentives that they would have to see how the system in effect behaved and what kind of effects, as we call, emerged from the collection of all the agents in the system. This diagram simply shows a decentralized market structure where we have generating companies. Well, generating companies on your left, and an independent system operator in the middle who's taking in bids on a daily basis. And then those bids result in essentially power being generated and distributed the following days to ultimately to consumers. The structure has the potential for other players, other agents to, let's say, emerge into the system in the form of agents such as brokers or even demand aggregators who, and you may be going through that here in Texas, we are just now in Illinois. Companies are offering to band together consumers together and then go and negotiate with the electricity power providers for better rates and, other benefits like that. In terms of the actual deregulation questions, there are several. Will power by transmission capacity be adequate, or is congestion likely? For those of you that are familiar with the electric power grid, you will know that transmitting power from point A to point B is not a simple operation because of the physics of the power grid. Will congestion in the transmission power grid create regional imbalances in supply and demand? Well, imbalances create pockets of market power, potentially driving up locational electricity prices. So there's a real possibility that because of the constricting nature of the power grid, that some locations are only served by a single generating company, for example, and that they would potentially have the ability to raise prices to levels that really would be unacceptable to the consumer. Now, one of the issues simply was that, and I should say this is the total load on the Illinois system by hour for every day in the base year which we ran the simulation for. And you can see that the total load is somewhere around 35,000 megawatts, in our peaks in the summer there. And there's actually, the actual capacity of generators in the state of Illinois was actually larger than this amount, roughly around 40 megawatts of power. So the issue was not whether there was enough in total to maintain electricity load, but again, it had to do with the spatial nature of the power and where it was distributed and what these locational marginal prices would produce.
Data or simulation?
No, this is actually the actual data. Yes. This is the timeline, and to make a long story short, the Illinois legislature passed a law in 1997 saying that power system in Illinois would be deregulated in 10 years later, presumably when the politicians who passed the law would not necessarily still be in office. But somewhere around 2002 or so, 2001, there was the problems with the California electric power system. Yes, the California electricity crisis occurred, in which there were brownouts and failures to meet, load requirements after they declared deregulation sometime before that. So this created a crisis in the state of Illinois in the sense that no analysis had been done of deregulation previously. So in this intervening time, they essentially commissioned us to do an analysis of what deregulation could likely do under many scenarios, since there's a great deal of uncertainty in various parameters and things that could occur. The electric power system for Illinois is very large, consisting of many transmission lines, plants, generating companies, but we modeled each of these elements in the physical power structure, infrastructure that we addressed. Yes, generating plants, generating blocks, generating companies. Transmission network is the focus as opposed to the distribution networks, because in the transmission network we're wielding power over large distances. It's complex to say the least, and to properly capture the behavior of the physical power grid, we teamed up with the University of Illinois, who had a alternating current power flow model for the entire Midwest region, shown here, and they were helpful in deriving what we call an equivalence network, which was a DC optimal power flow network model, which we incorporated directly into our agent-based representation. as part of what the independent system operator did to solve the day-ahead problem of matching supply and demand, which is a very realistic representation of how the system actually works. As I mentioned, there were load areas and connection points with those load areas, which resulted in locational marginal prices. So to get on with the agent approach, we modeled for each of the generating companies a model of decision making for how generating companies proposed bids into the day-ahead market. And these are fairly accepted ideas about the considerations for how generating companies make these decisions. There are some factors which are maybe specific to generating companies, such as the risk aversion of the generating company. Anyway, this is a representation of the full model in terms of the agents and the physical infrastructure. In the middle here, the middle layer, this is the actual physical infrastructure representing the transmission grid, and the links represent the transmission lines. The spheres in the middle represent the power plants in Illinois, which are color-coded according to the fuel type. In the state of Illinois, half our electric power is produced by nuclear power generators, so those are the big orange ones. And we have a lot of gas supply, which is blue. And then the rest, further down south in Illinois, comes from coal-fired power plants. On the far right, we have the layer which represents the load requirements by consumers, industry, businesses for electrical load. And again, these are color-coded by the distribution company that supplies that electric power, and coded by size relative to what the relative loads are. In Chicago, where we are located, the laboratory, I mean, there's a large set of load centers, and some here in St. Louis, and then there's some out west here. Now, on the far left, these are very interesting, these spheres. These represent the actual companies that own generating assets in the state of Illinois. They are also color-coded by their primary fuel type. This big orange one is Exelon Nuclear. There's two large coal companies here, I think Mid-America and Midwest Gen. And then there are a variety of smaller companies, gas companies basically, a few smaller coal companies. So what we did then, we attributed the decision-making behaviors to each of these companies based on the actual physical assets that they held or owned in the power grid, and for which they used as a basis for bidding into the power pools. We went further and modeled the possible strategies that generating companies would use potentially to, potentially to manipulate the market. And no one was saying that they would use such strategies, but the question had to be asked as to whether this was a potential for the state that generating companies having market power could possibly exercise them. So there are many ways to model strategies of generating companies. We essentially modeled all possible combinations of strategies that were plausible. For the most part, these strategies were ones that the Illinois Commerce Commission particularly wanted us to look at because they had been observed in other cases, in particular in California. And so we ended up running 2,000 scenarios. And essentially, to make a long story short, in all scenarios, electricity prices increased in every scenario. So if somebody says, well, how do you know your sensitivity analysis was correct? It's like, well, 100% of our results show the same thing. So at least in terms of the price increase, we were able to demonstrate, because of a variety of reasons, as much as anything, that demand was essentially inelastic for electricity. Consumers do not know how much they pay on a real-time basis. That is changing potentially, but certainly at the time of, well, in the last 5 years, that has been the case. We did further analysis, and we were able to identify, let's say, generating companies that had market power and generating companies that did not have market power. A generating company with market power, when it increases, let's say, its production or it sells electricity at a higher amount, there's two effects, of course. They may get more revenue, but it may shift the demand or reduce the demand for the electricity they generate because it could be supplied from other generating companies. And this is all worked out in the physical power grid in terms of what it means. So essentially here we were able to identify that yes, some companies did have market power. They may decrease their revenues initially, like in this red line, but that eventually, by larger increases, they would run into a situation where the substitution from other generating companies was not possible anymore, and so they had the ability to unilaterally raise prices. And there were many, many other results. We did testify before the Illinois Commerce Commission before deregulation went into effect, and these were the kind of issues that were of great interest to them. Two of the important findings really had to do with that it's important to have market monitors and, let's say, a procedure for flagging things like withholding of capacity in an attempt to exert market power or unilaterally raise prices. And the second thing, which was fairly obvious, but very clear from the results, was that consumers needed to have choice and options for incorporating the real-time prices of they're paying for electricity, into their behavior, reducing their demand, turning off their air conditioning, et cetera, et cetera. And so those things are coming to pass in Illinois as we speak, but very slowly. So a second application that I'm going to talk about has to do with solar photovoltaics. And the question is, what are the factors aside from the economics that limit the rate of residential consumer adoption of solar photovoltaics? There's a few secondary questions, such as, can we explain what the factors are, and can we understand them well enough to make better forecasts? What people would like to do is understand how solar adoption of photovoltaics, as well as other technologies, how that process occurs. And in particular, the government may want to understand how they could promote in the initial phases of a technology adoption, with minimal amount of expenditures, how that process could be improved, and understand actually what we call the barriers to adoption. That's another way to look at the same problem. So we have developed a model called BE Solar, and the BE stands for behavioral economics because it is based on a behavioral set of assumptions to model the solar adoption process of thousands of individual consumers. And we're applying the model in this current phase to replicate the rapid market adoption of residential solar photovoltaics that occurred in the Southern California market. This effect, which occurred a few years ago, was something that was not predicted by existing models, was not anticipated. But it resulted when consumers had the choice of not only buying units for rooftop solar voltaics, but also had the choice of leasing units. So installers would come in, leasing firms, solar leasing firms, and offer that possibility. And so with nothing else changing at all, when that effect began, there was a big jump up in solar photovoltaic adoption. The actual event that occurred was that the California legislature decided it would not regulate that market in terms of requiring financial, like large amounts of financial data, as if you were getting a mortgage or something, and so it would not be a regulated market like the mortgage market. So installers were free to come into the market at that stage and meet consumers fairly unencumbered. So the question is, we want to model actual behavior, but the question is, what are we going to do with it when we find out what the behaviors really are? Current models of solar photovoltaic adoption do not consider individual decision makers, and they do not capture diversity in realistic decision behaviors. The reason I can say that is because we work with the people who have current adoption models. They're at places like NREL and run various models. So we've worked with them extremely closely because they have, again, good data. So the basic idea is to develop a consumer decision model and consider all the factors, whether they're technology costs, the markets, the policies, the regulations, the networks, the financing, and the other stakeholders, but in a way that people actually consider the factors when they make their decisions about adoption. A lot of the background information and kind of frameworks for thinking through this problem come from the field of marketing. And this is your basic marketing model, marketing science model that comes out of, it's a 5-step process of consumer recognition, an information search, an evaluation of alternatives, a purchase of decision, then a post-decision of behavior. So we model each of these steps in the decision-making process. Ideas from behavioral economics are useful. They're not fully matured, however, in how they could be captured and put into such a kind of practical model. Notions of bounded rationality, social interaction, and social networks are key to this process, as well as there's a collective consumer learning process that goes on as well. In terms of how we would model agents in such a system, we look at essentially the owners of each, and this is a map for the Southern California area that we're working on. We take every single parcel of land in which there's a house, and we have data on the houses, publicly available data. Then we model the decision-making process that goes on for each one of those houses. And of course, it's key as to whether you own your house or you're renting your house, for example. Because after all, if you're a renter, you don't decide whether you put solar panels on your roof. If you're an owner-occupied house, then you make that decision. Secondly, we also model installers. And installers have initial contact with potential customers, so they cue people to actually make the decision, depending more or less on how they go about doing that, whether it's through the internet or door-to-door, etc. Activities of installers may actually limit adoption capacity. People may not have access to who the installers are. They may not know how to go about the process. Installers, if there's enough of them and they're contacting people, can promote that process. And then in terms of housing units, I already said we have parcels, housing types. This is just a very detailed how we would define an owner. We have an owner class, so to speak. And these are simply attributes that we have defined for the owner of a house, descriptions of what those attributes are. Some of them are standard demographic attributes. Some are unusual. Like here, in particular, here is an adopter category. And we have different classes of adopters being innovator, early adopter, et cetera. And those of you familiar with the innovation literature would recognize this as the model of Rogers and his innovation diffusion type thing. So we're incorporating these things into the model. Of course, it's key to have data to back up what these attributes are. So then in summary, in terms of adoption attributes, we consider ability to pay, energy attitude, adoption effect, meaning social contact with previous adopters, an adoption threshold, perceived reliability, and there is actually something called a hassle factor, which, as we heard from installers, is a key factor in people not wanting to bother with even going through the process of making a decision for solar photovoltaics. So reliability is part of that. Then there are other financial metrics which have to be meaningful to the actual consumer. And then demographics does play a role. We did some joint work with NREL and we looked at the demographic attributes which were most correlated with the adoption decision versus leasing versus owning. So we were able to, let's say, get the relative weighting factors from them. So my time is winding down. I have many more slides, which I won't bother to bore you with. But I think that one of the key things to remember is that behavior and modeling behavior and data on behavior and how people actually do things, which comes from behavioral economics, experimental economics in particular, and actual experiences of people in the real world, offer a real opportunity for incorporation into computational models, which could very well be more accurate and more sensitive to the real world factors that determine adoption and these kind of market effects that we're trying to capture. So I think on that note, I will end my talk. And thank you very much.
Hey, great talk. Appreciate you coming. So how is Illinois already fully deregulated at this
Yes,
point?
Illinois is fully deregulated.
So how good was the model?
How good was what?
Yeah, how would you say your model reacted to what actually occurred?
Well, I think that, without doing a detailed analysis, in terms of, comparing actual line outputs, everything that we predicted happened. Yes. Well, sometimes, maybe this isn't that hard sometimes, because, sometimes if you did an analysis, you would see that there's problems, coming. And so there's that part of it too, but if the model allowed us to look at many possibilities and to still get the same result, I think was pretty powerful.
Have you looked at all at the commercial scale solar market, and how do you think that, what similarities or differences are there with residential?
Well, we haven't looked at that so far because we simply haven't had the data to do that. I think that what we're trying to do, to be more clear about what we're trying to do, is to demonstrate in this initial residential model what the value is of looking at a very, heterogeneous approach, which incorporates behavior into the whole process of market adoption. And then once we prove that is useful, is to promote this as a methodology for applying in other areas.
Now that the mic is close. Methodologically speaking, I see that on ABMs, the need for data is very, very massive. But also, some of the agents will have more contact with a subset of the entire set of data. How do you make decisions as a modeler to where to end? I mean, where the connection will end, or you will model all interactions? You mentioned an optimized DC approach to an AC model, assuming that the meshed system might be resembling a star-like system, and then it would be more tractable, easier to manage. I mean, modeling-wise, and also on the example of the solar PV in Southern California, it seems to me, or I have seen in the past, some of these models, like the technology adoption models, that use structural equations. Or would you say that methodologically speaking, the ABM models that you use for that are resembling those behaviors of the agents as consumers adopting photovoltaics?
Well, let me answer the last question because I'm not sure I remember the first question. But in terms of existing models, for adoption, we're trying to build essentially what amounts to an adoption curve, diffusion curve, from the bottom up, though. And in the other models that are out there for handling this kind of problem, they're essentially assuming the adoption curve exists and parameterizing really what the curve, the slope of the curve and the inflection points, based on either looking at innovations of a different type in another field, possibly decades earlier and in other contexts, or having some very preliminary data on, the actual market they're looking at in that early phase, and trying to extrapolate. So I would categorize the traditional approach as more of a top-down approach versus a bottom-up, where the curve itself emerges out of the actual decisions consumers make. And in terms of, the data, you either, to build an agent-based model, you either have data, a lot of data, or you don't have data. An interesting and exciting area, of course, is to do data analytics on a large set of, whether it's social network data or other data that is being collected more and more for an automatic representation or derivation of a behavioral model. But a lot of the times in these early stages, we're working with situations where there is not a lot of data available. So we need to do things like surveys of consumers, for example, and understand what that decision process actually is that they go through. And let's say the proportions of people, and again, for marketing, it's a market segmentation process, just like any marketer, good marketer worth their salt would actually do. But these are on non-standard kinds of problems. So, I think that it's possible, it's promising, and, if we're here at the university, we want to do research. It's not a done deal so far, but these are really, I think, areas that will be promising. Not many people have done this and actually failed at it so far. I think, well, just to prove that, is it a worthwhile area or not, I think it is. But that's to be, shown.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
When you're talking about the when modeling the residential PV diffusion, and you're talking about contact with other owners,
Yes.
are you able to model in the, or I guess my question is, does the model predict adoption based on the characteristics of proximate owners? So, for example, the people that you're likely to reach out to, the characteristics of those people, whether they had a positive experience, for example, or the installer they used, size of their system, that kind of thing. Are you able to model that?
Well, we're not able to model the actual experience as to whether it's positive or negative in an explicit deterministic way. But we do model that probabilistically, which could be fitted from actual, data that's collected on consumer experiences. So the question would be, what percentage of people that have installed solar PVs in their, roofs have found that are satisfied, and what percent aren't satisfied? Those kind of things.
The reason Scott is asking that question because he's analyzing that data right now.
Okay, well,
Other questions?
well, okay.
Hi. I'm curious, so in your example of the power grid in Illinois, so
yes.
one would assume that one of the purposes of deregulation would be introduce competition, I think.
Yeah, that's the original idea.
And so when they broke it apart, did they inadvertently create like 30 separate insulated monopolies by accident? I'm curious, and then can you explain, were all those entities equally subject to the forces of free markets and competition? And then two, based on your modeling, what were the drivers that actually contributed to the rising cost of energy?
Okay, well, the in terms of the actual companies involved, I'd have to say that we saw what we anticipated from the concentration of the ownership of the generation assets at the company level. If you look at the industrial concentration, they're enormously high, just relative to the total capacity, which is never really thought of as being a good sign, from an industrial organization standpoint. So the additional, the addition of market monitoring, which is, let's say, voluntary on the part of, but all the generating companies agree to it, and they have a set of published rules that if anything is violated, like an unannounced outage at a critical time, which drives up, which withdraws capacity, but effectively shifts the supply curve, to the left, and everybody gets the same higher price. Are potentially flag situations that are open to everyone for inspection and investigation. I think that was, a very good, development. But in terms of the, the demand side, that was the primary driver of the electric power pricing, and the fact that, demand is not responsive was not responsive to real-time prices.
I guess, I'm sorry, so that's what I was getting at. So was there like an ancillary effect with competition as it related to demand? I mean, could you compete across the whole network of those nodes to...
Well, what happened was the large companies would own assets typically at many points in the grid. And then there were a lot of smaller ones who, might have small amounts of assets distributed here and there. So, as prices, as the large, owners, generating companies, prices increased, there was some degree of substitution, like internally, even for a fixed level of demand across the power network. But that was limited at some point, just because of the size of the generating companies, that they couldn't, resupply the entire amount. And again, it's not to say that the generating companies would exercise, kind of or manipulate prices in this way, but it had to be analyzed to see on the part of the regulators. So even though the Illinois Commerce Commission doesn't regulate the power, utilities, they still have a role to play, in, let's say, monitoring or understanding or being the interface, to the public. Eventually, as power prices increased, there became, there's political, stop measures that come in. The Attorney General, sued, the power, one of the power companies, over the price increases and stuff like that. So then, of course, then the pressure to raise prices is backed off. So there's a political process that feeds into it all. It's like you can raise prices, but only up to a point, or only so fast, and then it becomes a political problem, and it takes care of itself. Another aspect of this, I don't want to go on too long, but is when deregulation occurred, it didn't mean that the power companies in Illinois were supplying power to Illinois. They were like, Exelon is free to sell its nuclear power to New Jersey or across the whole Eastern Interconnect. So that's another interesting side effect of deregulation. And since we have all this excess capacity, relative to our own load, it's perfectly normal to expect that the power companies would sell to other places, potentially at higher prices, which could raise prices for everyone, even in Illinois. But these are like, undercurrents too. Anyway.
Let's thank our speaker again.
Okay.